Some people are only useful when they stay quiet, Evelyn Whitmore said, and the sentence fell across the dining room like ice dropped into crystal. The laughter at the table died so fast it was almost elegant. Naomi Carter stood beside the long white linen table with a silver water pitcher in her hand, her black uniform pressed flat, her shoulders still, her face unreadable except for the small tightening in her jaw that only someone watching closely would have noticed. Above her, the chandelier scattered warm light over polished glass, gold-rimmed china, and the kind of faces that had spent their whole lives being listened to. No one said a word. Not Daniel Whitmore, seated at the far end in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Naomi made in a month. Not Richard Whitmore, whose heavy watch glinted every time he reached for his wine. Not the guests, who suddenly seemed fascinated by the butter knives, the candle flames, the pale streak of sauce left on a plate. Naomi bent without a sound, picked up the folded napkin Evelyn had let slip from 2 fingers as if it had soiled her by association, and placed it back beside her employer's untouched dessert spoon. Her movements were careful, almost weightless, the kind of control that came from long practice. In this house, the wrong look could be called attitude. The wrong pause could be called insolence. Even breathing too loud seemed to belong to people with more money. Beyond the tall windows, rain tapped against the glass in thin, nervous streaks, and somewhere deeper in the house an old pipe groaned behind the walls. Naomi could smell lemon polish, rosemary from the lamb, and the faint bleach still clinging to the cuffs of her sleeves from the afternoon shift. She had been on her feet since 6 that morning. She had changed bedsheets on the 3rd floor, polished the library banister, steamed table linens, ironed Sophie's school uniform, and answered to Naomi, Nora, girl, miss, and once, without apology, sweetheart. Only one person in the house ever got her name right the first time. Sophie Whitmore, 8 years old, seated halfway down the table in a pale blue dress with a satin bow at the shoulder, looked up from her plate with wide, uncertain eyes. Her fork hovered in midair. Children knew when a room changed temperature. Sophie knew it now. Naomi felt the child's gaze before she met it, and when she finally did, Sophie's expression held the quiet confusion adults forgot children carried so well. Not fear exactly. Something sadder. The question of why kindness disappeared whenever company came over. Evelyn lifted her wine glass, satisfied with the silence she had made, and smiled toward her guests as if nothing unpleasant had happened at all. Now, she said lightly, where were we? The conversation restarted in fragments, brittle at first, then smoother, then almost normal, because that was what money did best in houses like this. It taught people how to keep eating through discomfort. Naomi stepped back toward the service wall, pitcher still in hand, her reflection briefly passing across the dark shine of the grand piano. She knew her place in the room. Last to be greeted, first to be blamed, useful when invisible, needed only when something spilled, burned, shattered, or stopped working. And still, as she stood there beneath the soft gold light and the practiced cruelty of polished voices, Naomi noticed what no one else did. Sophie's fingers trembling slightly around the stem of her water glass, the pinkness rising at the base of her neck, and the untouched almond tart waiting on the child's plate like a secret no one at that table was prepared to see. Naomi did not move right away. She had learned that in houses like this, there was a rhythm to humiliation, a beat after the insult when everyone waited to see whether the person beneath them would crack, speak, or shrink. She gave them none of it. She only stepped back into the soft shadow near the sideboard and refilled the nearest glass as though the temperature in the room had not just dropped 10 degrees. Around her, the dinner table stitched itself together again with the delicate desperation of people pretending not to have seen what they had clearly seen. A guest in pearls gave a small laugh that arrived too late. Another man cleared his throat and returned to a story about private equity and Palm Beach. Silverware resumed its careful music against porcelain. The chandelier above them glowed steady and golden, but the air underneath it felt thin. Evelyn sat perfectly upright at the center of the table, one hand resting beside her plate, the diamond on her ring finger catching the light. Every time she moved, she looked pleased with herself in the way some people did after proving they still had the power to make another human being feel small. Daniel, seated 3 chairs down, kept his attention on his phone for a moment longer than necessary, blue light sliding across his face before he finally turned it face down beside his glass. He did not look at Naomi. He did not look at his wife either. He only reached for his wine and took a measured sip, as if silence could pass for neutrality. Richard Whitmore, broad-shouldered even in age, pressed his napkin once against the corner of his mouth and glanced toward the rain-streaked windows. His expression gave nothing away. He had spent decades building companies, buying people, ending conversations with a single look. In another life, Naomi thought, that face might have been carved into a courthouse. In this one, it hung above the table like an old portrait everyone still feared. But it was Sophie who pulled at Naomi's attention again. The little girl had not touched her dessert. The almond tart sat neat and glossy on the china, glazed fruit shining under the dining room lights, a sliver of toasted almond resting near the whipped cream like decoration no one else would notice. Sophie's fork remained suspended in her fingers, but now her wrist looked loose, uncertain. Her shoulders had crept upward. Naomi saw the child swallow once, then twice, as if her throat had become a thought she could not get past. Mrs. Keller appeared through the kitchen door carrying a fresh basket of rolls wrapped in linen, her sensible shoes soundless on the hardwood. She had been in service long enough to feel tension the way old bones felt weather. As she passed Naomi, their eyes met for less than a second. It was enough. Mrs. Keller knew something in the room had shifted. Naomi lowered the pitcher onto the sideboard and folded her hands in front of her apron, the picture of restraint, but her mind had already moved ahead of the conversation at the table. She remembered the label she had seen earlier in the kitchen when the new pastry boxes arrived from the bakery in town. She remembered the bold line beneath the ingredients, the one most people ignored because it belonged to other families, other children, other emergencies. Contains tree nuts. Naomi's gaze returned to Sophie, just as the child finally lifted her fork. Across the table, Evelyn was smiling at a guest and saying something about summer in Nantucket. No one noticed the tremor in Sophie's hand. No one noticed the bloom of pink traveling higher along her neck. No one except the woman they had just reminded to stay quiet. Naomi had been inside the Whitmore house for 11 weeks, 3 days, and 2 quiet Sundays when the family was out at brunch and the rooms finally stopped performing well for a few hours. That was long enough to know which stair on the back landing complained in winter, which cabinet in the butler pantry stuck when the rain came hard, which hand towels Evelyn preferred in the powder room when guests were over, and which subjects made Daniel leave the room under the excuse of taking a call. It was also long enough to understand her place in the machinery of the house. She was the hand that reset the rooms after people with softer palms had finished using them. She was the one who noticed the lipstick stain before it set, the coffee ring before it marked the walnut, the fever in a child before the mother looked up from her phone. She entered spaces after doors swung open for other people and left before anyone could remember to thank her. Most days, that was fine. There was dignity in work done well, even when no one bothered to see it. But dignity felt thin in a room where a woman could be reduced with one sentence and expected to keep pouring water like nothing human had happened. Sophie lowered the fork another inch. Naomi saw the child hesitate again, her small eyes dropping to the tart, then flicking toward her mother, searching for permission to refuse. Evelyn did not notice. She was explaining to the woman in pearls why the chef in East Hampton had been impossible to replace since Memorial Day, her voice light, amused, lacquered with that expensive ease that made other women lean in. Daniel joined in with a comment about staffing, and something in Naomi almost smiled at the irony of hearing people discuss labor like weather while she stood 10 feet away holding the proof that labor had ears. Richard remained mostly silent, but his silence had shape. It pressed against the room heavier than conversation. He had noticed Sophie, Naomi could tell that much. His eyes had gone to the girl twice in less than a minute, though he said nothing. Men like Richard Whitmore often mistook watching for helping. At the far end of the sideboard, candlelight shivered over silver serving spoons and a bowl of white peonies beginning to brown at the edges. Naomi could hear the low thrum of the refrigerator in the prep kitchen beyond the swinging door, the muted hiss of rain against the terrace, the tiny, uneven catch in Sophie's breathing that no one at the table seemed equipped to hear. That was the thing about invisibility. After a while, it sharpened you. When people thought you did not matter, they let the truth happen right in front of you. Naomi had learned that lesson young. In hospitals where nurses spoke too quickly around her mother, in grocery stores where managers watched her more closely than the customers in Kashmir, in apartments where landlords heard her last name and suddenly needed another deposit. And now here, in a house big enough to echo, where the child who had once slipped her a vanilla cupcake wrapped in a napkin after school sat turning pink above the collar while the adults discussed wine, charity boards, and a weekend in Connecticut. Sophie finally looked up, straight at Naomi. And in that look there was no entitlement, no performance, only a small, silent plea from a child too polite to interrupt the people who were failing her in real time. Naomi felt her pulse steady instead of quicken. The room kept talking. Candlelight kept trembling. The fork rose. And the woman everyone expected to remain quiet knew she had maybe 3 seconds left to decide whether obedience mattered more than the truth. Naomi did not need long to make the decision. She only needed the memory of a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks earlier, when Sophie had come home from school with one sock folded down, a glitter star stuck to her sleeve, and a paper snowflake crushed in her backpack. Naomi had been kneeling in the upstairs hallway then, sorting fresh towels into the linen cabinet, when the little girl had stopped in front of her and held out a napkin with both hands like it was something fragile. Inside had been a cupcake from the school bake sale, vanilla with pale blue frosting already melting at the edges. "I saved this before my friend touched all of them," Sophie had whispered, glancing down the hallway as if kindness might get confiscated in this house the way noise did. Naomi had smiled and told her she should keep it. Sophie had shaken her head. "You always save the good towels for when I am sick," she had said, as if that explained everything. Then, after a small pause that had felt too old for an 8-year-old, she had asked, "Do grown-ups forget how to be kind when other grown-ups are watching?" Naomi had not answered right away. She had looked at the child's soft face, at the earnest way she waited, and chosen the gentlest truth she had. "Sometimes," she had said, "but the good ones remember again." Sophie had nodded as if she wanted to believe it, then set the cupcake beside Naomi on the folded towels and walked away in her school shoes, each little step quick and light against the hardwood. Naomi had eaten the cupcake alone in the laundry room 10 minutes later, standing between the industrial dryer and a basket of pressed pillowcases, and for the first time since taking the job, the house had felt less like a place she survived and more like a place where one small heart had made room for her. That memory moved through her now in the dining room, as clean and sudden as breath. Sophie was still looking at her over the candlelight, her fork caught halfway between the plate and her mouth, her skin no longer just pink, but blotchy along the neckline of her dress. The child shifted in her seat. A tiny sound escaped her throat. Almost nothing, just the kind of swallow that did not go down right. Naomi saw it. Mrs. Keller saw Naomi see it. No one else saw anything at all. Evelyn had started speaking again, this time about the charity gala next month and how impossible it was to find musicians who understood restraint. Daniel answered with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. One of the guests laughed too hard. Richard reached for his water, then paused, his attention turning back towards Sophie for one brief, unreadable second before drifting away again, because concern without action was still a form of distance. Naomi felt the old lesson rise in her chest, the one life had taught her over and over. If the truth entered a room through the wrong mouth, people called it disrespect. If warning came from the wrong uniform, they called it overstepping. But there were moments when obedience became its own kind of cruelty, and this was one of them. Sophie's fingers loosened around the fork. The silver slipped from her hand and landed against the plate with a bright, thin sound that cut through the room sharper than any raised voice. Heads turned. Evelyn frowned. Daniel straightened. Sophie touched the base of her throat with one hand. Not dramatic, not loud, only confused. Naomi was already moving before anyone else understood why. The room reacted the way expensive rooms often did when reality interrupted them, first with confusion, then with offense. Evelyn turned sharply in her chair, the diamond at her hand flashing as she reached towards Sophie with more irritation than alarm. "What is it now?" she asked, not cruel in tone exactly, but impatient in the polished way of a woman accustomed to problems arriving small and leaving quickly. Sophie did not answer. Her eyes had widened, and her lips parted as if she meant to speak, but could not decide whether breathing or explaining mattered more. Daniel half rose from his seat. napkin sliding from his lap to the floor, his expression blank with the helplessness of someone who had spent his life solving problems that came with reports, numbers, and other men in suits. Richard pushed his chair back a few inches, not enough to stand. Only enough to signal the old instinct that something in the room had changed from awkward to wrong. The guests looked from child to mother to servant, waiting for hierarchy to explain what their own senses could not. Naomi crossed the distance before anyone gave her permission to do it. The carpet softened her steps. The candlelight caught at the clean edge of her cuff. She stopped beside Sophie's chair and looked first at the child's face, then at the untouched tart, then back again. The rash had climbed higher now, spreading in delicate red patches above the satin neckline. Sophie's chest moved too fast, too shallow. One hand stayed at her throat. The other gripped the edge of the chair as if the room had tilted slightly, and she needed something solid to remind her which way was down. "Do not let her eat that," Naomi said, her voice low but clear enough to split the table in two. Every face turned toward her at once. For one suspended second, even the rain against the windows seemed to hush. Evelyn stared up at Naomi as though she had heard profanity at church. "Excuse me," she said, the words clipped and cold. Naomi did not look at her. "She should not have almonds," she said, still watching Sophie. "The tart has tree nuts." Daniel frowned. "How do you know that?" Naomi answered without raising her voice. "Because I unpacked the bakery boxes myself at 4:15, and the allergy label was printed in red on the side." Evelyn's face hardened, color rising under the smooth finish of her makeup. "You do not interrupt my table over dessert," she said. "Step away from my daughter." Sophie made a small sound then, thinner than a cough, more like a breath catching on something invisible. Mrs. Keller was already moving from the kitchen door, linen towel forgotten in her hand. Richard stood at last, slower than Daniel, but somehow more forceful, the chair legs pressing into the rug behind him. "Evelyn," he said, and for the first time all evening there was a warning in his voice. But Evelyn, humiliated by the fact that the only person speaking with certainty was the woman she had just belittled, turned that discomfort into anger. "This is exactly the problem," she snapped. "Staff in this house have started confusing proximity with authority." Naomi felt the words land and pass through her without staying. There was no time left for hurt. Sophie's breathing had changed again. Her lower lip trembled. Her eyes, glassy now, lifted toward Naomi with that same quiet trust from the hallway, from the cupcake, from every unnoticed kindness that had passed between them when the grown-ups were too busy performing themselves to see. Naomi bent just slightly, enough to bring her face level with the child's. "Sophie," she said gently, steady as warm water, "look at me, sweetheart. Do not eat another bite." And in that moment, while silver cooled on plates and pride still sat armored at the table, the richest people in the room found themselves waiting for the least respected woman in the house to tell them what came next. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The command had not come from the head of the table, or the mother, or the father, or the man whose name was etched into the stone outside the front gate. It had come from the woman in the service uniform standing beside a child's chair with dishwater scent still clinging faintly to her sleeves. That alone seemed to offend the order of the room. Evelyn rose so quickly her chair brushed the rug behind her. "That is enough," she said, each word polished hard. "You are not a doctor, and you are certainly not her mother." Naomi kept her eyes on Sophie. The little girl's breathing had turned shallow and uneven now, each inhale small, each exhale careful, as though her own body had become something she no longer quite trusted. A flush had climbed to her cheeks. Her lashes looked damp. Naomi knew that look. She had seen it years ago in a free clinic waiting room in Baltimore, when a nurse had handed her mother a clipboard and told them to sit tight, while a little boy in Spider-Man sneakers rubbed at his neck and tried not to cry. She had remembered the nurse then. Calm voice. Quick hands. No wasted panic. "Mrs. Whitmore," Naomi said, still steady. "Please listen to me. She needs the emergency injector from the kitchen drawer or from her school bag if you brought it home." Daniel looked from Naomi to his daughter, and the color drained from his face with startling speed. "Her injector?" he repeated, as if the words belonged to another family. Evelyn's expression flickered, not to fear yet, but to the first ugly hint of doubt. "She has a mild sensitivity," she said, too quickly. "That is all. The bakery assured us they were careful." Sophie let out another small, strained breath. Mrs. Keller was at the child's side now, one hand hovering uselessly over the back of the chair, her old instincts alive, but waiting for permission that should have already been given. Richard turned fully toward Evelyn, his voice lower than before. Did her physician prescribe an injector or not? That was the question that cracked the evening open. Evelyn hesitated, and the hesitation was answer enough. Daniel stared at his wife. "You told me she outgrew it," he said, his voice thin with something worse than anger. The dawning terror of a father realizing important information had been managed into silence. Sophie's fingers tightened around Naomi's wrist with surprising strength for such a small hand. Naomi bent closer. "You are all right," she said softly. "Stay with me. Slow breaths if you can." The child tried. Her eyes never left Naomi's face. Around them, the room had begun to lose its polish. One guest set down his fork with a trembling clink. Another reached blindly for a water glass and missed it by an inch. The candles still burned. The rain still traced the windows. But the conversation about Nantucket and charities and summer chefs was gone now, replaced by the far more democratic sound of fear entering a rich room and refusing to care who owned it. Naomi finally looked up, not at Evelyn this time, but at Daniel. "Call 911, she said. "Now? And have someone bring me her bag." The authority in her tone did not come from status. It came from clarity, the kind that only showed itself when everyone else had run out of it. Daniel did not argue. He reached for his phone with shaking hands. Mrs. Keller turned and hurried toward the hall. Richard stepped aside without being asked. And Evelyn, standing there in silk and diamonds with all her control draining quietly through the cracks, realized too late that the one woman she had ordered to stay quiet was the only one in the room who knew exactly what to do. Daniel moved first, but not with grace. His chair caught the edge of the rug. His phone nearly slipped from his hand, and for one strange second, he looked like a boy wearing a grown man's life by mistake. "What do I tell them?" he asked, already dialing, his voice breaking apart around the question. Naomi answered without looking up. "Tell them your daughter is having an allergic reaction and struggling to breathe. Give them the address first." The calm in her voice changed the room more than shouting would have. It gave panic a shape. It gave people something to hold. Daniel turned away, repeating the address to the operator with a stiffness that made every word sound expensive and useless at the same time. Mrs. Keller came back through the doorway carrying Sophie's school bag, her cheeks flushed, the leather strap twisted around one wrist. "It was in the mudroom," she said, breathless. Naomi took the bag and opened the front pocket with hands that stayed steadier than she felt. There were crayons, a spelling worksheet, 2 hair ribbons, a half-finished packet of crackers, and finally the small zip case she had hoped to find. Sophie's fingers still clung to Naomi's sleeve. The child's breaths had turned thinner now, each one careful and incomplete, and the bright room that had once felt too full of silver and people now seemed to narrow around that sound alone. Naomi opened the case and saw the injector inside, still sealed, still valid. Relief moved through her not like comfort, but like fuel. "Good," she said, almost to herself. Richard had come around the table by then, not crowding, just standing near enough to understand that this was no longer a dinner problem, no longer a matter of etiquette or embarrassment or whose voice belonged where. Evelyn hovered opposite him, one hand pressed to her own chest, her face losing color by the second. The performance had fallen off her completely now. No polished smile, no brittle authority, only the raw, bewildered horror of a mother who had mistaken control for safety and now found she could not command her child's body back into ease. "I did not know," she whispered, though no one had asked her anything. Naomi met Sophie's eyes. "Sweetheart, I need to help you now," she said, keeping her tone low and warm. "I am right here." Sophie gave the smallest nod. Naomi used the prescribed injector as directed, quickly and carefully, with Mrs. Keller shielding the child from the startled eyes at the table and Richard turning his body to make space where there had been none before. Evelyn made a sound at the sight of it, not loud, just broken. Daniel ended the call and came back toward them with the operator still speaking through the phone. "They are on the way," he said. "They said to keep her still, keep watching her breathing." Naomi nodded once. "Then that is what we are going to do." She knelt beside Sophie's chair and rested one hand over the little girl's cold fingers. "Look at me," she said. "Not the room, not the noise. Just me. Sophie tried. Her eyes fluttered, then steadied. The red at her neck still burned against the pale blue satin, but after a few long moments her breaths began to stretch just enough to count. One in, one out. Thin, but present. Around them, no one returned to their seat. No one touched the wine. The guests stood uselessly at the edges of the dining room, their wealth stripped of function. The only sounds now were the rain at the windows, the uneven breath of a child, and Naomi's voice, soft and sure, carrying through the house that had never respected her until the moment it could not manage without her. Then, from far beyond the gate, the first faint rise of sirens slipped into the night. By the time the front doors opened, the house no longer felt like it belonged to the Whitmores. It belonged to urgency, to wet shoes on marble, to clipped voices moving faster than money ever could. The paramedics came in carrying Rain on their shoulders and a red medical bag that looked startlingly plain against the carved banister, the oil paintings, the cream-colored walls that had spent years reflecting only curated light. One of them, a woman with dark hair pulled tight at the nape of her neck, dropped to one knee beside Sophie and immediately began asking clear, practical questions. What had she eaten? When had symptoms started? Had an injector been used? Naomi answered before anyone else could sort panic from fact. One bite, maybe less, she said. Symptoms started within a minute. Rash at the neck, throat discomfort, shallow breathing. Injector administered 3 minutes ago from her school bag. The paramedic looked up sharply, taking in Naomi's uniform, the calm in her face, the child's hand still wrapped around her sleeve. Good call, she said, and then turned to her partner. The words were small, almost casual, but they landed in the room with more force than praise usually did. Daniel stood near the end of the table, phone hanging useless at his side now, watching the scene like someone seeing his own home stripped of illusion board by board. Evelyn tried to move closer, but the second paramedic lifted a hand and asked for space. She stopped at once. There was no argument in her now, no polished correction, just fear and a silence so complete it seemed to hollow out her posture from the inside. Richard remained near the windows, shoulders squared, hands at his sides, saying nothing, though Naomi could feel his attention on her every time she spoke. Sophie's breaths, while still fragile, had begun to lengthen. The panicked tightness around her eyes eased by degrees. Her fingers stayed locked around Naomi's sleeve as if fabric could anchor her more securely than the expensive chair beneath her. The paramedic checked her airway, monitored her breathing, and spoke gently in the firm voice of someone used to borrowing calm when families had none left to offer. You did really well, she told Sophie. We are going to take care of you. Sophie's eyes shifted, not to her mother, not to her father, but back to Naomi. She comes too, the little girl whispered, the words thin but unmistakable. For 1 second, no one responded. Rain ticked softly against the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer that no longer mattered gave a lonely chime and went unanswered. Evelyn closed her eyes like the sentence had reached someplace painful. Daniel looked at Naomi then, fully looked at her, maybe for the first time since she entered the house 11 weeks earlier. Not as staff, not as background, as the person his daughter had reached for when breath became precious. If they allow it, he said quietly, more to the paramedics than to anyone else, she goes. Naomi almost answered that it was not necessary, that the family would want privacy, that there were linens to clear and plates to move and 1,000 small invisible tasks waiting in the wreckage of the evening. But Sophie's hand tightened again, and Naomi felt the choice leave her before she spoke. The paramedic gave a brief nod. One family member and one support person can follow in another car, she said. We are moving now. The room shifted around that instruction. Guests stepped back. Chairs scraped. Mrs. Keller gathered Sophie's bag and coat without needing to be asked. Richard moved first to open the path through the dining room. Daniel reached for his daughter's blanket from the sitting room. And Evelyn, standing in the middle of the house she controlled so completely only an hour ago, watched as every eye turned not to her, but to Naomi, waiting for the woman no one respected to rise and lead the next breath of the night. The ride to St. Andrew's Medical Center took 12 minutes. Though inside the ambulance time did not move in minutes anymore. It moved in breaths, in monitor tones, in the soft rustle of emergency blankets, and the measured voices of people trained to keep fear from spreading faster than facts. Naomi sat near Sophie's shoulder, not in the way, not pretending to be family, but close enough for the little girl to keep hold of 2 fingers beneath the edge of the blanket. The paramedic who had praised her earlier worked with steady efficiency, checking Sophie's airway, listening to her chest, asking simple questions in a voice that made answers easier. Sophie whispered when she could. Naomi answered when the child could not. Outside the back doors, the city slid past in blurred ribbons of wet streetlights, pharmacy signs, and red brake lights reflecting on rain-black pavement. Daniel followed in the sedan with Evelyn beside him, and Richard in the back seat. But inside the ambulance, none of that mattered. The hierarchy had been left behind with the crystal glasses and untouched dessert. Here, what mattered was who could keep the child calm, who remembered what she had eaten, who had noticed first, who could tell the difference between panic and danger. Naomi did not think about that directly. She only kept her voice low and even. "You are doing all right, sweetheart," she said as Sophie's eyes drifted toward the ceiling lights. "Just stay with the sound of my voice." Sophie swallowed carefully and gave the faintest nod. At the hospital entrance, the doors opened into white light and motion. The smell changed at once from rain and leather to antiseptic, coffee from a vending machine somewhere down the hall, and the faint metallic cold of air conditioning turned too low. Nurses met the stretcher with practiced speed. Questions came fast. Age, weight, known allergies, time of exposure, injector administered when. Naomi answered clearly, each fact placed where it belonged. One of the nurses looked from the chart to Naomi's uniform, then back to her face. "Are you family?" she asked. Naomi opened her mouth, but Sophie answered first, her voice rough and small. "She stays." The nurse did not argue. They moved Sophie through double doors, and for the first time all evening Naomi had no task left to perform except wait. The sudden stillness felt strange, almost louder than the dining room had been. She stood in the hallway under unforgiving fluorescent lights, a dark stain of rain still drying at the hem of her shoes, a faint smear of whipped cream dried pale against one cuff from the dessert plate she had brushed aside. A few feet away, a television mounted in the corner played muted weather updates no one watched. Daniel and Evelyn arrived seconds later, both moving too quickly and yet somehow not fast enough to outrun what had already happened. Daniel reached the nurse's station first, then stopped when he saw Naomi standing there, calm and exhausted, and very much not where any of them had ever imagined she would be. Evelyn slowed beside him, mascara untouched, but something far deeper undone. Neither spoke at first. They only looked at the woman they had spent the entire evening diminishing, and at the closed doors beyond which their daughter was breathing, because Naomi had refused to stay in her place. A doctor in navy scrubs stepped into the hallway moments later and asked, "Who administered the epinephrine before arrival?" Daniel turned toward Naomi without hesitation. He did not even seem to notice what that admission meant. "She did," he said. And in that bright, cold hallway, with the whole family gathered and helpless beneath the hospital lights, the answer sounded less like explanation and more like the beginning of a truth none of them would ever be able to unsee. The doctor was younger than Richard expected and older than Daniel felt, with tired eyes, steady hands, and the kind of calm that came from delivering hard truths without decoration. He listened as Naomi gave the timing one more time, then nodded once and glanced at the chart in his hand. "That early dose made a real difference," he said. "Her airway is responding. We are keeping her for observation, but she is stable." Stable. The word moved through the hallway like warmth finally reaching cold fingers. Daniel exhaled so sharply it was almost a sound of collapse. Evelyn closed her eyes and pressed her hand over her mouth. Not for show, not for anyone watching, but because relief had a way of weakening the body after fear had been holding it upright. Richard stood still beneath the fluorescent lights, his coat still damp at the shoulders, his face turned toward the doctor, but his attention sliding, slowly and unmistakably, back to Naomi. "You got lucky tonight," the doctor added though. His tone suggested luck had not been the only thing in the room. A delay of even several more minutes could have made this much worse. No one answered right away. The vending machine hummed. A nurse rolled an empty wheelchair past the far end of the corridor. Somewhere behind closed doors, a monitor gave its soft, repetitive pulse. The hospital had that strange way of making every family feel equally small, no matter what waited in their driveway, or how many floors their house had. Daniel ran both hands over his face, then lowered them and looked at Naomi with the dazed honesty of a man who had no polished response left. "Thank you" sounded too small for what sat in his throat, and maybe he knew it, because he did not stop there. "I did not see it," he said quietly. "You did. You saw it before any of us." Naomi looked down at the pale smear on her cuff, the faint sugar mark from the tart, now dry against the black fabric. "She looked at me," she said. That was enough. Daniel swallowed hard. Evelyn remained silent for several seconds, her composure not shattered but rearranged into something humbler and far more human. When she finally looked up, she did not look like the woman at the dinner table with Crystal at her elbow and a sharpened sentence ready at her lips. She looked tired, frightened, older somehow. "I told them she had outgrown it," she said, more confession than explanation. The last reaction was so mild, and the specialist said children sometimes improve, and her voice thinned. "I did not want her to be fragile." Naomi met her eyes without cruelty. "Pretending a danger is gone does not make a child safer," she said softly. The words were not dramatic. That was what made them land. Richard shifted his weight and glanced toward the closed double doors where his granddaughter had disappeared minutes earlier. "No," he said after a long pause, his deep voice quieter than anyone in the Whitmore household had probably ever heard it. "It does not." A nurse stepped out then and asked whether one of them wanted to sit in the family consult room while they finished settling Sophie in observation. Daniel nodded immediately, but before he moved, Sophie's small voice floated from behind the cracked door, thin from strain, but clear enough to stop everyone in place. "Naomi." The hallway changed all over again. Naomi did not hesitate. She took one step toward the room, then another. No one told her to wait. No one corrected her place. Daniel stepped aside first. Richard held the door wider. And Evelyn, standing in a pool of hospital light with mascara untouched and certainty gone, watched the woman she had dismissed walk into her daughter's room as if she had belonged there all along. The room was smaller than the Whitmores would have liked and kinder than they deserved. Soft monitor lights blinked above the bed. A clear bag of fluid hung from a pole. The blanket pulled over Sophie's legs was thin, pale, and warmed at the edges by hospital air that smelled faintly of antiseptic and laundry soap. The little girl looked impossibly small against all that white. Her cheeks were still flushed, her hair a little loose at the ribbon, her voice scraped thin from the strain on her throat. But when Naomi stepped inside, Sophie's face changed in the smallest, deepest way. Some of the fear left it. "You came," she whispered. Naomi moved to the bedside and rested her hand lightly over Sophie's fingers, careful of the monitor clip on one small index finger. "Of course I came," she said. "I told you I was right here." Sophie looked past her then, toward the doorway where Daniel, Evelyn, and Richard stood in a silence too full to enter. "She stays," the child said again, more firmly this time, as if the adults in her life had earned exactly zero faith on that point tonight. The nurse checking the monitor gave a quick smile and stepped back. "For a minute, that is fine," she said. Naomi drew the chair closer and sat. The metal legs made a soft sound against the tile, a plain little sound in a plain little room, and somehow it steadied everyone more than the Whitmore fortune ever had. Sophie's fingers curled tighter around Naomi's hand. "I could not breathe," she said, her eyes filling not with drama but with the delayed shock of a child finally safe enough to feel what happened. "I know," Naomi answered. "But you did exactly what you needed to do. You stayed with me." Sophie swallowed carefully. "I was scared." Naomi brushed a loose strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Being scared does not mean you were not brave." At the door, Daniel lowered his head for a second and looked away. Evelyn stood completely still, her posture no longer sharp with control, but softened by the terrible understanding that her daughter had reached instinctively for someone else. Richard remained in place, one hand resting on the doorframe, his expression unreadable until the nurse glanced at Naomi while updating the chart and said, "You handled that like someone with training." Naomi hesitated. She had not planned to offer any part of herself tonight that was not necessary. But Sophie was watching her, and the room had already stripped pretense away from everyone else. "I had some," she said quietly. "A long time ago." The nurse paused. "Medical." Naomi gave the smallest nod. "Nursing school. 2 years. Then my mother got sick, and classes became rent, and rent became groceries, and after that life moved faster than plans. The sentence settled over the room with more weight than any accusation could have carried. Daniel looked up first, startled not only by what she had said, but by how much of her life had existed within arm's reach of his and gone completely unseen. Evelyn blinked hard, as if shame had arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a series of details finally lining up into something impossible to excuse. Richard's face changed last. It was only a slight shift, a tightening around the mouth, a deepening at the eyes, but Naomi saw it. Recognition, not of her resume, of the cost. Sophie looked from Naomi to the others and back again. "Are you going to disappear now?" she asked, the question so small it nearly broke the room. Naomi leaned forward until her voice was the gentlest thing in it. "Not tonight," she said. "I am not going anywhere tonight." Sophie let out one slow breath, the first peaceful one anyone had heard from her all evening, and closed her eyes. Outside the room, the monitors hummed, wheels rolled, and distant voices carried through the hallway. Inside it, the richest family Naomi had ever worked for stood in silence, while the least valued woman in their house became the one promise their child believed. After Sophie fell asleep, the room grew so quiet that every small sound seemed to matter. The monitor gave its steady, patient pulse. Rain tapped faintly against the far window at the end of the hallway. Somewhere beyond the half-closed door, a cart rolled past with the soft rattle of plastic wheels over tile. Naomi remained in the chair beside the bed for another minute, maybe two, long enough to make certain Sophie's breathing had settled into something even and untroubled. Only then did she ease her hand free from the child's fingers and stand. The motion was careful, almost reverent, as if peace itself might wake if handled too quickly. When she turned, Daniel was still at the doorway. Evelyn stood a little farther back now, one arm folded across her waist, the other hanging loose at her side like she had forgotten what to do with it. Richard had not moved much either, but there was something different in the set of his shoulders. Less command, more weight. They stepped into the hall together, and the door clicked softly behind them, sealing Sophie inside a pool of hospital light and second chances. For a few seconds none of them spoke. The hallway smelled like coffee gone stale and floor cleaner. Naomi became suddenly aware of the long day still clinging to her body, the dampness at the hem of her shoes, the stiffness in her back, the sugar stain on her cuff, the fact that she was standing in a hospital at nearly 10 o'clock at night in a uniform meant for polishing silver and changing sheets. Daniel was the first to break. "You should not have been the one carrying us through that," he said, voice low, roughened by guilt and exhaustion. "But you were." Naomi did not answer at once. She had learned that apologies from powerful people often arrived tangled in their own discomfort. Some wanted absolution before they had even finished understanding what they had done. But Daniel's face held none of that. He looked like a man staring at the wreckage of a blind spot he had mistaken for competence. "I kept thinking someone else would notice," he said. "The doctors. Evelyn. Me. My father. Anyone. But it was you." Naomi rested one hand lightly against the back of the chair she had just left. "Children do not wait for the right title in a crisis," she said. "They just need the right person to pay attention." Daniel shut his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was no defensiveness left. "I am sorry," he said. "For tonight. For all of it. For every time I let this house turn you into part of the wallpaper." The truth of it hung there, plain and unadorned. Naomi could have cut him with it if she wanted. She could have made him sit inside the embarrassment of finally saying aloud what he had allowed. But Sophie was asleep behind the door, and vengeance felt too loud for the hour. "Then do better when we go home," she said. That was all. Daniel nodded like the sentence cost him and steadied him at the same time. Richard spoke next, and when he did, his voice had none of the old boardroom steel in it. "I built my life on the idea that competence reveals itself," he said. "That talent rises if it is real enough." He looked at Naomi then, directly, with the kind of eye contact men like him usually reserved for equals. That was a convenient lie. Naomi said nothing. She did not need to. The hallway itself seemed to hold the admission for a beat longer than sound should last. Evelyn had been silent through all of it, but now she lifted her head. There was no elegance in her expression, only a woman stripped down to what fear and shame had left behind. "Why was she the only one who knew what to do?" she whispered, not to Naomi at first, but to the empty space between them, to herself, to the long corridor of choices that had led them here. Then she looked at Naomi fully, and the question changed shape. It was no longer accusation. It was confession. Naomi met her eyes, tired but unshaken. "Because I was watching," she said softly. "And because I have spent my whole life learning what happens when no one watches people like us closely enough." Evelyn flinched as if the sentence had found its mark without ever being raised. No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to defend. Only the quiet truth of a sleeping child behind a hospital door, and the woman they had asked to stay quiet standing in the center of everything that mattered. By the time morning softened the hospital windows from black to pale gray, the night had burned most of its pride out of everyone. The storm had moved east. The parking lot below the fourth floor glistened with leftover rain, and the first weak light of dawn lay across the rows of cars like a promise too careful to speak loudly. Naomi had dozed for perhaps 20 minutes in a molded plastic chair outside Sophie's room. One hand folded in her lap, the other still faintly marked where small fingers had clung to it for hours. Her neck ached. Her shoes felt heavier than they had the night before. The sugar stain was still on her cuff. Nothing about her looked extraordinary. And yet when the nurse came out with the discharge updates and the breakfast tray rolled in with rubbery scrambled eggs, dry toast, and apple juice in a sealed cup, every question still found its way to her first. Not because she was in charge on paper. Because she had become the point around which the night had steadied. Sophie was sitting up now, color returning to her face, hospital bracelet loose on her wrist, her hair brushed back with a soft pink band Mrs. Keller had fetched from the school bag. She looked tired in the way children do after fear, all softness and honesty. When Naomi stepped back into the room, Sophie's eyes lit before she smiled. It was not dramatic. It was better than that. It was certain. "You stayed," she said. Naomi crossed to the bed and touched the blanket near the child's knee. "I said I would." Daniel stood by the window holding a paper cup of bad coffee he had not touched. Evelyn was beside the bed, quieter than Naomi had ever seen her, one hand resting lightly near Sophie's ankle, as if she had relearned overnight that love could be gentle without becoming invisible. Richard stood near the door in yesterday's coat, broad and silent, and changed in some way that would probably never make him softer, only truer. A doctor came in a few minutes later, explained the follow-up care, renewed prescriptions, strict allergy precautions, school forms, and emergency planning. Daniel listened like a man taking notes for the first real time in his life. Evelyn asked questions and did not interrupt the answers. Richard asked for duplicate instructions to be placed in the kitchen, the mudroom, Daniel's car, and his own study. When the doctor left, the room held a new kind of silence, one not made of class or discomfort, but of reckoning. Daniel turned first. "When Sophie comes home," he said, looking at Naomi with clear, steady shame, "things in that house are going to change." Naomi did not rush to thank him for a promise that should have existed long before this night. She only nodded once. Richard stepped closer then, his gaze level, his voice low. "You were the strongest person in our home last night," he said. "Not the loudest, not the richest, the strongest." It was not flowery, not polished. Coming from him, that made it heavier. Evelyn swallowed and looked down at the blanket before forcing herself to meet Naomi's eyes. "I was wrong about you," she said. Then, after a painful pause, "No, I was wrong in how I chose not to see you at all." Naomi heard the difference. So did everyone else. Before she could answer, Sophie lifted both arms from the bed in the simple, unquestioning way only children could make love look honest. Naomi leaned in, and Sophie wrapped herself around her with the last of her strength, cheek warm against Naomi's shoulder. The room went still. No one corrected it. No one looked away. And when they returned to the house later that morning, past the tall doors and polished floors and the chandelier that had watched everything, the hallway did something it had never done for Naomi Carter before. It opened. Mrs. Keller stepped aside with a small, knowing smile. Daniel held the front door. Richard waited in silence. Evelyn said her name correctly. Then Sophie, still pale but smiling, reached for Naomi's hand and walked with her through the center of the home, as if there had never been any question about where she belonged. And in the bright, quiet aftermath of a night that had stripped everyone down to what was true, the family finally